Saturday, 7th of September 1940, dawned fine and clear. Forecasters expected the early morning haze out over the English Channel to lift. It was perfect flying weather, but for the men and women of RAF Fighter Command, it could only mean one thing: another day of mortal combat. For 60 days, RAF Fighter Command had been locked in a deadly tussle with the German Air Force for control of the skies over the Channel and Britain's south coast. A German victory would mean that the way was clear to mount an invasion. Although heavily outnumbered, their airfields barely usable, and combat fatigue starting to take its toll, this was a fight that the young men and women of RAF Fighter Command could not afford to lose.
I think it was a shared experience. Everybody was on a very high state of nerves, and everybody knew that if Fighter Command didn't hold off the Germans and the German army landed, we were finished.
For 60 days, the pilots of Fighter Command had been fighting to keep the German bombers at bay. The small attacks on shipping in the Channel were becoming much larger as the bombers moved inland to attack RAF bases and factories building aircraft. For the RAF pilots, a clear day meant that they could expect to be called into action at any moment to face a much larger force of enemy aircraft. The tension and stress of mortal combat was taking its toll.
In the end, you didn't think about it. You were tired. I could always see dawn readiness. I can see the Spitfires standing in the gloom at dispersal. I can hear the airmen and the clank of petrol bowsers. And I can remember sort of looking up at the sky and thinking, oh, it's going to be a lovely day again. Oh God, another dawn, Said a little prayer. It's going to be a very busy day, oh Lord. If I forget you, don't forget me. Just give me this day. Please give me this day.
We were all developing what we called the twitch. Because you didn't have enough sleep and because you were so anxious, your anxiety was showing, and you had this bloody twitch, which was not cowardice, but your nerves were so shaken. You were seeing all your chums being killed, and you having experienced ghastly things, and very often when you landed you found there were bullet holes in your aeroplane. And I know at the end of the war, when I drank a pint of beer, I had to pick it up with two hands.
It seemed Geoffrey Wellham's prayers were answered because the morning of 7th of September was very quiet. But by the end of the day, the war had taken a different turn. Civilians suddenly found themselves in the front line of a bombing campaign that began with Black Saturday. Today, we call it the Blitz. Britain's fate hung on a knife edge, but for the RAF pilots, the day began in much the same way as every day had started since the beginning of the Battle of Britain 60 days earlier.
Well, you were often told you were going to be up at dawn, so you actually got up in the dark and you went straight down, having had a quick breakfast, down to your dispersal, and you sat there waiting for things to happen. Sometimes if you were told there's no activity going on, we would wander up and go to the ops room and sit around looking to see what was happening, or we would just stay down at dispersal and have a quick nap. And there were lots of books and magazines to read, and we would often talk to the airmen and find out what they had been doing. A lot of very good chaps had been conscripted in, and they were always very keen to talk to the pilots. And we would pass the day that way. It was pretty exhausting, and towards the end of the day, you were absolutely shattered.
The battle had begun with attacks on shipping and ports in an attempt to lure the British fighters into combat and starve the civilian population of its essential supplies. The tactic failed because the head of Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding, had ordered that only the minimum number of aircraft be scrambled to meet the attackers. By using his resources carefully, he hoped to keep Fighter Command in the battle long enough to enable new pilots and aircraft to become available. Hitler had already authorized preparations for the invasion of Britain. Codenamed Operation Sea Lion, German commanders agreed that it could only go ahead if the RAF was defeated. Just how committed Hitler was to agreeing to an invasion as opposed to forcing the British government into some sort of negotiated peace is still discussed to this day. But there were enough senior commanders around him who felt that such an invasion would be at best extremely costly. Among them was Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe. However, on the 1st of August 1940, Directive No. 17 was issued, ordering the Luftwaffe to launch its aerial assault. Goering had a point to prove in that the Luftwaffe had failed to deliver the decisive, crushing blow at Dunkirk. Now he promised that the RAF would be defeated in days, if not a couple of weeks. The 13th of August was chosen as the decisive day and codenamed Adlertag, Eagle Day. From the 13th of August, the campaign was widened to include airfields, radar installations, and aircraft factories. The Castle Bromwich area of Birmingham was home to a large number of factories vital to Britain's war effort. Among them was a factory building Spitfires that were proving so effective against the Luftwaffe. Birmingham had already been attacked on the 9th of August, but on the 13th the bombers returned and bombed that Spitfire factory, killing 7 and injuring 41 people. It was the start of a blitz against the city that would earn it the grim distinction as the third most bombed British city after London and Liverpool. The long daylight hours of summer enabled the Luftwaffe to mount increasingly large attacks using hundreds of aircraft, which the RAF was struggling to counter. Sometimes pilots would find themselves going into battle several times a day. On the radar screens, the plotters watched the bombers as they formed up. It could take up to an hour for them to get their formations ready and meet up with their fighter escorts. The aerial armada would then head towards the British coast, some 15 minutes of flying time away.
Tea time on a Sunday. I don't know why. The Germans used to love that. Tea time, they used to mass up. We could see them forming up on their, well, our radar boys could see them and they used to tell us, oh, they're forming up now. And they used to start their bomber formations over the coast of France. We should see them over there.
But on the 24th of August, events took a turn that would not only lead to the start of the Blitz, but also prove a turning point in the course of the Battle of Britain. Oil storage tanks in Rochester and Thameshaven were the intended targets, but some of the bombers failed to identify them correctly and dropped their deadly cargoes over London itself. Over 100 people were killed and 400 injured as the bombs exploded in the city and the West End. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was outraged, convinced that this was a deliberate move by the Germans to widen their assault on Britain. He ordered RAF Bomber Command to attack Berlin in retaliation. At nearly 600 miles away, the twin-engine bombers would be operating at the extreme limits of their range. Despite its limited capability at this stage of the war, RAF Bomber Command managed to get around 90 aircraft in the air on the night of the 25th of August. Navigating at night was never going to be easy, and yet around 80 aircraft found their way to Berlin and dropped their bombs. Damage was limited and no one was killed, but the effect on the Nazi leadership was profound, especially as Goering had only recently assured Berliners that an attack on the German capital was beyond British capabilities. Over the next 2 weeks, the RAF returned 5 more times to bomb German cities. Hitler was outraged. Frustrated that Fighter Command had still not been beaten and losses were mounting, he ordered an immediate change of strategy. London would be attacked in force. London was an obvious target. Here was the Houses of Parliament, not only the very heart of the British Empire, but also the last bastion of democracy that was resisting the Nazis' attempt to establish their own 1,000-year Reich. It was also home to over 8 million people. If, the reasoning went, the bombing caused enough destruction, civilian morale would crumble and public opinion would turn against their political masters, demanding that they sue for peace. As the intensity of the fighting increased, RAF Fighter Command was getting close to breaking point in its efforts to counter ever larger formations of bombers and their fighter escorts. On the 31st of August, the RAF's losses were the heaviest of the whole of the Battle of Britain, 39 aircraft shot down and 14 pilots killed. But the Luftwaffe had suffered even more losses.
And so you knew perfectly well that the country was at stake. And I don't know what others thought, but I was absolutely aware that this was it. We just got to do the best we could. We got to get them down.
Success with the 501 Squadron was to stop the bombers getting to London, making them drop their bombs into the Thames or drop their bombs into fields. That was where you had success. If you could turn the bombers, which was our job, and we did. We don't say on every occasion by any means because there were so many of them, but we did turn them, and that was our job, to turn them. And they did on lots of occasions drop their bombs at random into the fields and on the Thames. But of course, I'm not denying the fact that they didn't heavily bomb London. They did. I remember them bombing the docks when we were at Gravesend. It was a terrible state that was. We didn't stop them that day. They went in and bombed the docks and they made a terrible mess of it.
Although it seemed to be never-ending, the pilots of fighter commands were about to be handed a badly needed respite. On the morning of the 7th of September, as the ground crews busied themselves patching up aircraft from the previous day's action, pilots lazed in the sun. The London Fire Brigade reported less than 100 incidents, a quiet day by their standards. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Goering and his entourage visited some of the airfields in northern France. Poor interpretation of intelligence led him and his senior officers to believe that Fighter Command was all but finished, and he wanted to take direct command as they went in for the kill. He regaled his pilots with tales of his exploits as a fighter ace from the First World War, before retiring for a good lunch on the cliff tops overlooking the English Channel. From here he watched as the bomber formations took off. In all, 348 bombers were escorted by over 600 fighters. Their target was London.
It was business as usual. The whole table was covered with raids. They were coming in from the east, from Holland. But of course we had radar, which was a great boon to us because a fighter aircraft, especially in those days, could only stay up for a very short period of time. And this meant that we could plot them from when they started out so that the aircraft didn't have to hang around in the air waiting to see what happened. We were able to scramble them and direct them as needed, and that made all the difference.
In the lead-up to the outbreak of war in 1939, the big fear had always been that the bomber will always get through. And indeed, that's exactly what happened on that fateful Saturday in September 1940. Although the defences functioned correctly, in reality it was the sheer weight of numbers that saw the bombers break through to London.
By 4:15, the first wave of this mighty armada was crossing the English coast. The Observer Corps reported many hundreds of aircraft approaching. By 5:30, the first aircraft were over London's docks and the workers' houses in London's East End. The civilian population was about to experience the full force of what was to become 57 days of continuous bombardment. The Blitz had begun. For the next 2 hours, the bombs rained down. Incendiaries were dropped to start fires and illuminate the target for other aircraft armed with high explosive bombs designed to blow buildings apart. Some were fitted with delayed action fuses, timed to kill and injure civilians and rescue workers as they cleared the wreckage. At about 6 o'clock, the bombers headed back to their bases. Men, women and children emerged from their shelters to survey their wrecked neighbourhoods. But there was more to come. At 8 o'clock, the sirens wailed across London once again. The bombers were coming back, over 300 of them. For hours, they pounded the docks and surrounding areas.
We first saw Croydon on the night of the 7th of September. We flew down from Drem to Abingdon, refueled at Abingdon, and flew in towards Croydon from that direction, and it was about 6 o'clock at night, and it was the day, of course, the Germans got through and bombed the docks. So from miles away, before we got to Croydon, we could see the flames and the smoke, and the whole of London seemed to be on fire. Huge volumes of smoke and black smoke and flames and so on.
And when we landed at Croydon, just about as it was getting dusk, that's what we could see. So that was our introduction to what it was going to be like. And Bunny Current said, "Oh God, we're in for trouble now." And well, so we were. But that's what we wanted. That's what we came down for.
We were on 24/7, and that's when the Germans turned their attention to bombing London at night, and there was a big fire raid to start with. And though we plotted all these aircraft coming in, we had very little night fighting defences. I think there were about 2 bow fighters, something like that. They did develop it later, but at that point there was very little that the Air Force could do. The anti-aircraft guns and the balloon barrage were the only defence. And we came up for a break. We used to go up. They had a small canteen at the top of the stairs, and we came up for a break in the middle of that night, and we looked towards London, and the whole sky was on fire. And we were in tears. Most of us had friends or family in London, and there was absolutely nothing that the Air Force could do. Nothing at all.
Such was the ferocity of the attack that the code word Cromwell, signifying invasion imminent, had been issued by General Headquarters Home Forces the previous evening, mobilising the Home Guard. Unfortunately, some Home Guard commanders had already called out their units by ringing the church bells. As this was the signal that an invasion was already in progress, it simply increased the general sense of nervousness and fear. As dawn broke on the morning of the 8th of September, the bombers left, leaving the exhausted firemen, ambulance drivers, and all the civilian defence services that had been put in place for this eventuality to reflect on how well prepared they really were. In 1935, the Home Office began encouraging civilians to volunteer for a newly established corps of men and women under the umbrella of air raid precautions. The service brought together a diverse range of skills that would be needed in the event of a mass bombing attack. They had practiced what they needed to do several times. ARP wardens became a familiar sight on British streets, monitoring the blackout and coordinating the rescue services. Local control rooms were set up to deal with the stream of information and reports that came in during an air raid. The controllers could then direct which rescue services were needed and where. If it was a particularly heavy raid, they could call on support from other areas. They would organise the rescue parties who would bring out the casualties from the bombed buildings and provide basic medical support until the injured could be transported to a hospital. They also had to retrieve the dead and oversee their transportation to the emergency mortuaries. Welfare measures were also put in place to support the injured and people bombed out of their homes. This would involve finding suitable accommodation, issuing new documentation such as ration books and identity cards, and money to buy food. Inevitably, in the face of such chaos, the system was open to abuse and fraud was widespread. A women's volunteer service was formed so that women could work alongside the men as observers and fire watchers. They also set up the emergency rest centres and mobile canteens that provided a much-needed morale boost to both the rescuers and those who had been bombed out and left with nothing but the clothes they were standing in. As well as high explosive and incendiary bombs, it was assumed that the Germans might use gas and even bacterial weapons. 50 million gas masks were issued before the war in the expectation that London would be attacked with gas on the first day of war.
I had one, but never ever used it. Tried it on once, I believe. I would say they were not too uncomfortable. But what really did surprise me about gas masks was the ones that they issued to babies, to put babies in. They looked awful. Didn't understand those at all.
Although it was not compulsory to carry them, the public were urged to get used to them by wearing them at least 15 minutes a day.
You had to carry it at all times. In fact, I was never ever stopped for not carrying it because all it was a cardboard box with a string. That was what you carried it with, a string.
I think it was pretty general because all over the country people carried their gas masks and wore their gas masks. Yeah, we had to practice with them on at school.
With so much preparation going on, it seemed that war was inevitable. The tensions in Europe reached its climax as German forces swept into Poland during the early hours on the 1st of September 1939. Britain and France issued an ultimatum that unless Germany withdrew her forces from Poland, they would be at war. A deadline was set for Germany's response by 10 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd of September. But there was no response, and so Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced to an expectant nation that Britain was now at war with Germany.
We shall be fighting against brute force, bad faith, injustice, oppression, and persecution. And against them I am certain that the right will prevail.
The fear was still there that the bomber will always get through. Indeed, Chamberlain's announcement of the outbreak of war in 1939 had barely finished when the siren sounded for the first time.
We knew war was coming by then, and when war was declared, as it happened, we were out on the airfield. We dispersed our aircraft away from hangars and obvious targets, and I made the mistake when the local civilian air raid warnings went off. I scrambled with my flight because I didn't want to be caught on the ground as had been happening in Poland, and so I got into trouble over that because station commander said, "I'll tell you when you can fly it and when you don't." And obviously it had to be kept under some sort of control.
The first one I can vividly remember was on a Sunday, and 3 of us were up by Wandsworth Common scrumping apples from the gardens of people, very rich people that lived up there. And suddenly the siren went off, the very first one that we ever heard. And we all looked at one another startled and ran. And as we ran, we threw the apples into the gardens that we was running through Loxley Road and ran home, just to be with our parents because we felt safer with them. But that was the very first time that we heard the sirens go off. And we stayed there until the all clear went. And then when the all clear went, we went back and got our apples.
I was with my father down the end of the garden, building and putting together the Anderson underground air raid shelter. That's what we were doing. And it's quite true what the chap said. The air raid siren went almost immediately when it was announced by Chamberlain, you know, that we were at war. And whether or not it was a bit of a sham, we don't know, but of course it was a sham, there was no such thing. But the number of people who were quite panicked by it was amazed. But really and truly, for myself, I never really appreciated the density of it because I was 11 years old at that time. But that's what we were doing.
In order to reduce the risk of mass panic, it had been proposed to evacuate 4 million women and children to safer places in the country under the watchful eye of the Women's Volunteer Service.
In the tense period leading up to the outbreak of war, Britain had undoubtedly prepared its population for the oncoming aerial onslaught. Gas masks had been issued, blackout regulations introduced, air raid shelters distributed. But following the invasion of Poland in 1939, this period of intense activity soon developed into what has become known as the Phony War. To others, it was called the Sitzkrieg or Boer War. There was a danger that complacency would set in.
The government's overriding concern was how to protect millions of civilians in the event of an attack. Images of the bombing of civilians during the Spanish Civil War increased the sense of urgency that something had to be done. Although the government was worried that digging such large shelters would cost too much and take too long. There were also worries that the occupants would feel so safe that they might refuse to leave to return to work, or that anti-war sentiment would develop in large congregations of civilians. In the event, London was not bombed on the first day, and the shelters were ready by June 1940. But London already had an existing network of communal shelters, the London Underground. During the First World War, civilians had used the Underground during air raids. The authorities wanted to avoid this, and in 1939 refused to allow the stations to be used as shelters, so as not to interfere with commuter and troop travel, and again that occupants might refuse to leave. Underground officials were ordered to lock station entrances during raids. But by the second week of heavy bombing, the government relented and ordered that the stations be opened.
I hardly ever slept, only a few nights in shelters. Now my sister-in-law, at that time, my brother was back and they were married. She slept in the subway, on the floor. That was something to be seen. And the people lined up all day. I couldn't do it. I mean, how could you work and how could you do it? I don't know. She didn't work at the time. But to stand to get that little space on the floor with the train practically next to you, going all night. And she did that for many months. She and many others. When I met her, I always took her to her little spot. And then I went home. I was never afraid in London to walk in the dark. It was very safe at that time. It's not as safe now, but at that time it was very safe. Nothing ever happened to you in the dark, unless you were hit by a bomb.
At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, underground staff would let the queuing civilians in to go and claim their spot on the platforms and booking halls. By late September, around 150,000 people were using the underground as shelters from the relentless bombing, where, deep underground, they could at least get some sleep. The conditions could be filthy and insanitary. And in October 1940, work began to adapt the underground to provide better facilities. Despite the conditions, a new type of spirit grew. Not the mass panic feared by government, but a camaraderie that crossed the social divide.
As the bombs continued to rain down and the Blitz raged on night after night, no one was sure when the onslaught would end. People started to seek shelter underground. For some, this was the start of what has become known as the Blitz spirit. For others, it was a time of intense suffering and degradation, marked by dust, heat, sweat, squalor, petty crime and antisocial behaviour.
The most common type of shelter was the Anderson shelter, named after Sir John Anderson, who was the then Home Secretary. The Anderson shelter came as a kit of corrugated steel sheets, which were designed to be partially buried in the ground. Earth was then piled on top to provide some insulation and extra protection.
My mother and father was asked if they wanted an Anderson shelter, and they said yes. So an Anderson shelter was delivered, and my father and Mike, who lived downstairs, dug the necessary hole and put the Anderson shelter. And it was a relatively simple job, and because when the shooting started and shrapnel started to fly about and bombs started to fly about, we did start to sleep in the Anderson shelter. It had its use until one night we were all fast asleep in the Anderson shelter and we woke up covered in water. The River Wandle overflowed and filled the Anderson shelter up with water. And we never used the water again, never used the Anderson shelter again after that.
I remember spending a lot of time in air raid shelters, the Anderson shelters, which we had then. And my parents or people used to say that if you could hear the bombs whistling down, because they made a whistling sound, then they were not overhead and they wouldn't hurt you. I don't think that this was true actually, but it gave us great comfort. We all thought, oh, we can hear them whistling down, so we're quite safe.
The Anderson shelter wasn't very large. Wasn't very large at all. I can't remember the exact dimensions, but it certainly wasn't very large. And with 5 of us and a baby sleeping in there, it was full. But my father had arranged it so that we had almost like bunk beds, one on top of the other. And generally speaking, because I was the youngest, I was the one on top. Which was fine when it flooded because I didn't get wet until I got off it. But you felt when you went, you generally went down there. But as you were going to go to bed, say for example at 10 o'clock at night or something like that, then you would go down to. There was no light down there of any kind except torches. We never had any sort of lighting down there at all. And you just literally did go down there to sleep, and that was all. And remember, in those days we had no radios or anything like that to listen to, so there was no entertainment down there. And then you came out of the Anderson shelter Dad would leave early to go to work, and then gradually we used to come out to get ready to go have breakfast and go to school when school started again. But it gave you a feeling of security. We honestly believed that it would stop us being hurt if a bomb fell. I don't suppose it would stop a bomb direct hit, but no. On the whole, they were very good. They were very good.
As the Blitz continued, and the reality of spending night after night in shelters and having to endure the conditions that entailed, people inevitably began to consider taking the risk of returning to their own homes.
We lived in what they called an Anderson shelter, which was a corrugated, like a Quonset hut, but it was in the earth. You dug your own foundation, you put that under the earth and covered it with earth. And we would sit up nights and nights, days and nights, and sit up in that shelter. But after a while you got so tired of sitting in the shelter that you just took your chances. Every night from about 7 o'clock at night till 7 o'clock in the morning, the Germans would bombard London ferociously. It was unbelievable. And you would just sit up and hopefully go to sleep. But I remember after a while I said to and at that time I was living with my grandmother. I don't know where Mrs. Coleman was, but I think she was away. I was again being farmed out to my grandmother. And I remember saying to her, you know, I'm not sitting in that shelter anymore. I'm going to go to bed. And after tremendous arguments, I finally went to bed and I wouldn't sit in the shelter anymore. I had some close calls on that, but he was terrible, and I think what he did to those Germans, and I can never trust them again.
In 1941, because we were no longer sleeping in the shelter, we were sleeping in the flat, and in February 1941, a bomb dropped and landed 3 or 4 houses away from us and totally demolished our house. And I was trapped in my bed by falling rafters, not hurt, but just couldn't get out. And it took them a couple of hours to get me out, in actual fact. But it was very, very uncomfortable because of the dust and the dirt and all the rest of it. That really was the most important thing that happened to us during the war at that time, because from then we went to live in this deep shelter, and again we were isolated, really, really isolated.
Despite the privations of living night after night in shelters, life went on almost as if nothing had happened. There was a determination to carry on and make the best of things.
There was a strange spirit about people. People accepted the fact that it was dangerous. You just thought nothing of it. We would go up on the underground, which was took nearly an hour to get, because it's right at the end of the underground, the Piccadilly line, and then we would go into various hotels and nightclubs, which were much smaller. They were little places then, but we would dance, and there were dance bands, and if there was a rain, it was just a nuisance, really, because it made it very difficult to get about. Most of the underground didn't stop, but most of the buses and things like that stopped running.
We used to go to the same places. We used to go and stay at the Strand Hotel, and opposite was a lovely pub. And in that were a lot of people, and the barmaids who all knew us because we'd been there for a long time. And they used to tell us that their mother's home had just been bombed and so on, and you realise this was something we had to win. It sort of added to your determination to be successful, but it was good because you felt and realised how appreciated you were. We were achieving something.
At 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, you've got 24 hours off, which meant travelling through London. And I've never forgotten travelling through London on the underground and seeing these hundreds of people laying on the platform, sleeping. A lot of them elderly ladies with children. Now, I can remember more than once when these elderly ladies would get up and see my RAF uniform with my wings, and they'd get up and put their arms round me and say to me, "You boys carry on, you boys carry on. We rely so much on you." I've never forgotten that. And then get into Euston Station, where I would get a train to Rugby for a few hours. Going to Euston Station, the bombs would be falling around, and these elderly ladies again would be serving us cups of tea. There'd be a little canteen inviting us in to have a cup of tea. And they were all elderly people. I've never forgotten these elderly ladies. It's wonderful.
Whilst the bomber crews were allocated specific targets, generally speaking, the bombing was quite indiscriminate. Although it was the workers' houses in the East End and other London suburbs that bore the brunt of the onslaught, even Buckingham Palace itself found itself under attack. This famously allowed the Queen Mother to once declare that she could now look the East End in the face.
I remember seeing the Thames was aflame. I mean, it was aflame for days. They couldn't put out the fires. And then they had what they call Molotov baskets, which were incendiary bombs, which would come in baskets and the whole streets would be on fire.
The damage to property was enormous. 250,000 houses were destroyed and around 1 million people were made homeless. Organisations and charities set up to help those bombed out of their homes were frequently swamped and unable to help beyond providing a cup of tea and encouragement. Many were left to improvise as best they could.
My father, all that time, was looking for somewhere to live other than a shelter, and he found, with some friends of his, they found a house in Aldrin Road, 21 Aldrin Road, that had been bombed, was in a bit of a state, but it was a nice little house, and he contacted the owners, and they gave it, Mum and Dad, a lease on the property, and with some help from his friends, they did it all up and we went to live in that.
London was bombed almost continuously for 57 days and nights. The daylight attacks reached their peak on the 15th of September, which today is commemorated as Battle of Britain Day. 2 large air raids were launched against London, with dogfights taking place for most of the day. Goering hoped that by bombing London, he could tempt RAF Fighter Command into one final battle.
At one point in the afternoon, all the lights at the back of the ops room, which showed the state of the squadrons, every single one showed airborne. And Mr. Churchill turned to Sir Keith and said, "What reserves do you have, Air Vice Marshal?" And he replied, "None, sir." It was that close. We were so busy, didn't really have time to think about it. We just did the most that we could. Everybody was working flat out.
I think it was a shared experience. Everybody was on a very high state of nerves, and everybody knew that if Fighter Command didn't hold off the Germans and the German army landed, we were finished. It was a desperate situation, a desperate time.
Never going through London was I ever abused in any way, shape or form. No. It was always their arms round you. Wonderful. A lot of them with Cockney voices, but they were good. I've never forgotten it.
Goering's plan to defeat the RAF by using the bombing of London as bait failed. Poor German intelligence assumed that the RAF's position was a lot worse than it really was. This and large losses persuaded Hitler to cancel Operation Sea Lion provisionally until October, but in effect indefinitely. His plans for the invasion of Russia were already well advanced, and he knew that German forces could not fight the war on two fronts. Although the bombing was a terrible experience for Londoners, the diversion away from RAF targets gave Fighter Command the breathing space it desperately needed to recover and rebuild its strength. The daylight raids were becoming unsustainable for the Luftwaffe as their losses mounted. In the face of a recovering RAF, from the 7th of October, the German bombers began operating almost exclusively at night, exposing a new weakness in Britain's defences.
Effectively, we had no preparation, we had no preparedness. Well, we had nothing to help us at night except perhaps searchlights, and they were not at all satisfactory because our weather here, particularly in winter, was mainly cloudy. And until radar came along, we had virtually no defense against night. Anti-aircraft fire made a big flash and a bang and wasn't very effective. Started off with really no defense at night until after the day battle finished in September 1940, we got radar into our aeroplanes, and the first night fighter that was effective was the Bristol Beaufighter.
At the start of the Blitz, Britain's defences were not ideally suited for night fighting. Britain's pilots, for example, were not necessarily trained for combat in the dark or given the aircraft most suited to the task. Battling in the bombers at night was an art the British were about to learn, and quickly.
It was very much a cat and mouse affair. We were sent to a field, Bybury, two fields locked together. A flare path, believe it or not, made up of 6-volt bulbs. That's all the flare path we had. You couldn't see it until you'd found the used to have a coloured light, and they'd put it 5 miles from the airfield in different places, and you had to remember where the airfield was in relation to it when you got back, and then find the flare path and get down. So that was tricky for a start. Then we had no homing device at all in the aeroplane. So if, first of all, they had to pick you up when you took off. And the way they did that was to tell you to fly left or try right and see which blip on their screen was the one that did that. Sometimes they got it right, sometimes they didn't. So sometimes you're up there, not under control, and wondering when you'd be under control or even get back to your base or not. On one particular occasion, I was sent up, and I patrolled. I think they had lights on the ground you could patrol if you were told to do. So you do that until they decided they wanted to control you. And I wanted to ask questions. I turned up and didn't get an answer. I did this several times. Then I realized that somebody's left his transmitter on down there, and I heard them talking to each other, asking for cups of tea, etc. When I was sitting up there in the black, depending on that for my life above from anything else. Yeah, that was very annoying. Anyhow, on this occasion, I was told to go after a bogey, which was near Bristol at 20,000 feet or something. So I flew in that direction. I saw the searchlights, obviously looking for something. And as I got nearer to it, there was this one in the searchlight. But as soon as I got up to it, the searchlight came back to me, and the ack came on me instead of... This is, again, a thing that occurred because it was easier to follow something directly than try and get ahead of it, you see. So I did what I had to do, which was to flash a light we have underneath, which tells them to stop firing. So they stopped firing, the lights went out as well. So blackness except for the stars up there. Lots of stars, black night. And I was looking at it, where is the bugger? Flying in the sort of direction I thought it was, and I saw a red glow and then another red glow next to it, not too far away. And I thought, that must be it. So I went after these two glows, and it was difficult because to concentrate the speeds and not look in the cockpit at all, keep sight of these. So eventually I did get into position. And I went on firing at this thing. And eventually flames came from one of them. And that made it easier. I kept going at the fuselage on the other. And then the other one, they both went out, that's right, as it curved away. And then I couldn't find it anymore, so I came back. But in fact, both engines caught fire and it forced landing on the south coast somewhere. But that was all there was, but it was just really, the beginning part was just concentrating against difficulties on finding it and following it.
When I think about sitting in my turret with my one machine gun, I often wondered as to whether at night, probably no moon, so very, very dark, whether I should ever get a chance to fire at the enemy, because he would have to be fairly close if he's going to do any damage, and if he saw me first, he'd probably wipe me out before I had my chance to do anything. So it was rather a case of hit and miss, really.
Despite the best efforts of the RAF pilots, the bombers were getting through. Anti-aircraft fire and barrage balloons simply made the approaching aircraft fly higher and drop their bombs over a wider area. In yet another change of strategy, the Germans began mounting large raids against other industrial cities. On the night of the 13th and 14th of November, Birmingham and Coventry were both hit by large waves of bombers, almost unhindered by defences. The raid against Coventry was particularly devastating. Over 500 bombers succeeded in devastating large swathes of the city for the loss of one aircraft. The first wave knocked out the utilities, like the water supply, and cratering roads to make it difficult for the fire brigade and rescue services to get through. The second wave then dropped incendiaries and high explosives to destroy buildings. Although the aim of the operation was to destroy factories, it was inevitable that the surrounding areas would also be hit. In one night, more than 4,300 homes were destroyed and 2/3 of the city's buildings damaged. It would be months before the factories were back up and running. The human cost was estimated at 568 killed and over 1,100 wounded. The casualty figures might have been a lot higher if it were not for the fact that many civilians in British cities began trekking out to the countryside and surrounding villages as night fell to avoid the raids. To Coventry slipped into the grim lexicon of war. However, the raids on other cities did not mean London was off the hook. One of the largest raids struck on the night of the 29th and 30th of December. Around 100,000 bombs fell on the City of London, creating a firestorm that covered an area larger than the Great Fire of London of 1666. Firefighters struggled to contain the fires as the water main had been ruptured and pressure was low. Attempts to draw water from the Thames were also thwarted due to a low tide. As the fires raged, it looked as if St. Paul's might be in danger. Winston Churchill was mindful of the impact on civilian morale its loss would have and ordered that the cathedral be saved at all costs. In the morning, it was clear just how narrow an escape it had been.
Christmas the 31st, I think it was the end of December, when I was at Northolt and with 601 Squadron. And they bombed the city of London that night. They set fire to London that night. You could read a newspaper at midnight at your thought. The flames were such.
1941 began with yet another change of strategy by the Luftwaffe. The new priority was Britain's ports, facilities and any shipping at sea or in their harbours. Once again, major ports like Liverpool became the main targets because of its status as the main port for the Atlantic convoys. In March, better weather saw an increase in raids, with ports like Plymouth and Portsmouth being hit 5 times by the end of the month. As well as these large raids, small groups or even single fighter bombers were sent over to harass small villages and towns.
We'd all attended church, about 4 or 5 lads and some girls, you know, young girls. And we were walking across this field, which in theory was out of bound, and an ME-109 sort of banked round, came across the field and started to shoot us up. And I rang with my cousin, threw it into a ditch, and I jumped into a ditch, and all the rest of them jumped in a ditch, and we never got injured. But when we got home, you know, I got a right bottling because my cousin, you know, was absolutely smothered in mud.
The last major raids on London came between the 10th and 12th of May 1941. Over 1,400 people were killed and a further 1,800 injured. Westminster Abbey and the law courts were damaged, while the chamber of the House of Commons was destroyed. But British defences were improving. The first Bristol Beaufighters, equipped with radar, had not entered service until November 1940. Now they and radar-controlled gun and searchlight batteries were beginning to take their toll. During a raid on London on the 19th and 20th of May, 26 aircraft were shot down. The Blitz failed in its original objective of breaking the RAF and British industries. Although many other cities were bombed, London suffered more major raids than all the others put together. But the Blitz also failed to break civilian morale, even if it was shaken at times.
But the population seemed to be extraordinarily stoical. I used to spend quite a bit of time in the underground air raid shelters of the time, and there would be people singing. I recall a chap who had a mouth organ, and he'd put it in his mouth, didn't touch it, but he played all sorts of music, tune of it. There was an enormous spirit. People weren't down at all. It was extraordinary to see how uplifting it all was, really. I think it's the British stoicism, you know. Really remarkable.
With the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of Russia just weeks away, most of the Luftwaffe bombers were withdrawn from Western Europe. There would be more raids, but the worst of the Blitz was now over.